Hi everyone, welcome back to Gentlemen Prefer Cinephiles. It is still Noir November. We have some double episodes coming out today and tomorrow, so it's going to be super exciting. Today I'm covering Gilda, and then Alex and I are kicking off our new horror series. We're covering all of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, so once you're done with this podcast, it would be awesome to go and check that one out. It's super in-depth. It covers every single one in the franchise, and it was super fun to record. Then tomorrow we have our Saturday show coming up with political films, which is good, which is a really, really good episode. And then we're doing a 3-part Noir November podcast that covers The Lady from Shanghai, Mildred Pierce, and Sunset Boulevard. So we have some full content here just to make sure you have some stuff before we jump into 007 December, which I am so excited about. 007 December. I've been preparing for it for weeks with Evelyn. We're covering every single James Bond movie, so that'll be super, super interesting, and it'll be super cool to see how they change over time, what they show about the time periods they were made in and all that stoof. So yeah, then we're closing out December obviously with the best and worst of 2019. So yeah, look forward to that, everybody. So anyway, getting into today with Gilda. So Gilda is a textbook film noir film. It's interesting too because Gilda's an interesting case of a film noir film. So you see, like, the thing that makes Gilda a film noir more than anything is the inclusion of Rita Hayworth and the title character, Gilda. Gilda is seen by film scholars, film historians, as like the perfect example of a femme fatale. So a femme fatale is like that's the stock character in film noir films where she's, a very bad woman who is seductive using her sexuality, X, Y, and Z, dangerous, blah, blah. She's a huge archetype in the genre, as we talked about in the Asphalt Jungle episode, and Gilda is the prime example of that. So yeah, Gilda, it's interesting too because usually when you see a film noir, the big joke about film noir films is that they're pretty much a one-note kind of movie in which, or they're one-note kind of genre in which, you get a detective trying to solve a case, there's like a bunch of gritty stuff happening, there's gangsters, there's corrupt politicians, there's corrupt police officers, blah, 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 and then every, shenanigans happen throughout the film noir. But Gilda is interesting because it does indulge in that, especially the gangster element with all the gambling and being set in a casino in Buenos Aires and all these things, but the twist is that Gilda is about a love triangle. It's about Gilda and Johnny's character, Johnny is played by Glenn Ford. So that's the super intriguing part about Gilda, is that it isn't a film noir in that it indulges in the traditional narrative elements of a film noir, and what a film noir is interesting because it takes a different type of story format with the same aims as film noir to, expose the gritty underbelly of society, expose, the trappings of certain relationships, to show gambling, to show corruption, X, Y, and Z. So that's super, super interesting. Also, I kind of agree with this in this review by her name is Brat Pitt. She's one of my favorite Letterboxd reviewers ever, and she's like, anytime Gilda is on screen, smiley face emoji. Anytime Gilda is off screen, sad faced emoji. When Gilda is dancing, excited emoji. And that's kind of how I feel. Like, this entire film, it's a very good film. I'm not going to take that away from it. It's an excellent film. However, I think it could be better in that it feels like Rita Hayworth is the one holding the movie together. She's pretty much carrying the entire movie on her back, because Glenn Ford in this role, he's not super strong, and neither is Gilda's husband, Munson. So yeah, that's just a note to make. But moving into the tactical elements of Gilda. So the inner workings of Johnny and Gilda's relationship is really interesting too, because when you're looking at a film noir, there's usually no redeemable characters except the image of the femme fragile, which the femme fragile is just completely taken out of the equation with this. It's really interesting. You have kind of a play on the femme fragile with the man who Gilda talks to at the bar. I'm completely forgetting his name. He's a bartender. I think his name is Uncle something. But he has a really interesting play on the femme fragile archetype because he kind of fulfills that section of the narrative, especially in terms of looking at Gilda and Johnny's relationship. Then with Gilda and Johnny's relationship, the interesting thing about it, going back to the whole like everybody is a corrupt and bad figure, I guess, because it's showing the gritty underbellyness. Everyone is just abusive towards everyone, and that was a really intriguing thing for me going into the movie, especially with a type of relationship like this. Now I think for sure that Johnny takes it 10 steps further than Gilda in terms of the abuse. Gilda's just kind of messing with him, but I really, really love the part of the movie in which Gilda is acting out against this man who she feels has done him wrong, because it's if we're talking, showcasing it and, vivisecting the male and female, roles at the time, X, Y, and Z. Also, when you look at Charles Vidor, particularly, he loves to deal with stuff like this, particularly in Gilda, as well as, I'm completely forgetting, Scorsese cites it all the time. 1 second. Vidor likes to deal with it a lot, essentially. If I remember the name, I'll come back to it. But Charles, it's a huge narrative archetype for him to kind of look at male and female roles through the wrong they do to each other. And that's really, really fascinating throughout the entire film, especially when you see Johnny and Gilda repressing their feelings for each other, and that, being acted out in the hate and in the, I guess, mass hatred and anger that they act towards each other with. That is super, super interesting. Then when the film moves in, it just feels very old time Shakespearean almost as well, the way the whole narrative plays out with Johnny kind of taking over and then marrying Gilda when Munson disappears, and then the circumstances of their marriage, and also the whole relationship between Johnny and Gilda's husband Munson is also very fascinating to me, because I didn't really look at it through a queer theory lens, so I can't really say if I think it's coded like homosexually or not. However, there is a strong showcase of men's relationship to each other, and it's interesting because like the way Munson and Johnny interact, there's a very clear power dynamic. It's based in Johnny doing things for Munson even though Munson isn't there, and this really interesting sense of purpose in terms of malehood and looking at men who feel sense of purpose towards each other when there isn't necessarily a brotherhood to be shared there is super, super fascinating to me, especially in terms of the relationship and with the woman in the time, because when you look at Gilda seen as an object to these two men, Gilda is playing that game in a way that benefits her until it gets to the point in which she's married to Johnny and Johnny's acting out against her, and he's I guess torturing her by just not letting her go around with men, not letting her do whatever she wants, X, Y, and Z, trapping her in the marriage and becoming a prison. But the interesting thing the film emphasizes as well, it's not like it gives Johnny a pass at that behavior and says, and creates this lens in which it's okay that Johnny has been abusing Gilda the entire time. It's the opposite. So it gets to this point in the narrative where it's showcasing that Gilda and Johnny's hatred had gotten to a point in which they're both in a prison. And it's also not like Johnny gets a pass for the things he's doing to Gilda as well. The film makes a very, very strong emphasis and strong point in discussing the fact that it's a prison for both of them. It's a prison for Gilda because she feels like she has to get back at Johnny. And it's a prison for Johnny because he feels like since he's repressing his feelings for Gilda on one hand, but he's also, upholding this male brotherhood on the other hand. And so it just becomes a prison for them both, and they're not even doing what either of them want at the end of the day. So they're both confined in this never-ending cyclical nature of hate, and that is so interesting and fascinating. And then side note, actually, before we end, because I just noticed this, the other interesting thing about Gilda, which I think helps me put like some of the it helps me contextualize some of the things at the time, or some of the more problematic elements, or why, I guess, a quick note about Gilda before I leave too. Another interesting thing about it is that it was actually produced by Virginia Van Up, who is a female producer and screenwriter. And she was like, it was a very weird thing at the time for a woman to be a producer like that. So yeah, like, she's actually going to come up again in next week's episode, or tomorrow's episode, because she was involved in Lady in Shanghai as well. But looking at a woman who is producing these films, in old Hollywood, producers were very synonymous to directors. They worked very closely together, and their artistic liberties, like, were very across. And knowing that the film was produced by a woman gives a lot of context, and it kind of shows why the film doesn't, I guess, play into some of the more problematic elements. It shows why, you know, for an example, the abuse between Rita Hayworth and Glenn Ford, it shows why the abuse isn't super heavy-handed for Johnny and against Gilda, and why it's more even keel. That's really interesting to me. So that's just a note for the film. The film was produced by a woman in a time where that was not necessarily done. And then the other interesting thing that I found in the film was this whole kind of, because it was the mid-40s when the film was released, and the whole kind of World War II indulgence the movie takes, where Munson is visited by German mobsters, and then they were all funding this cartel, and then after World War II is over, he can take it over, but he does. So the whole relationship between Munson and, like, the German mobsters that he interacts with is indulgent in World War II in a very, very interesting way. It reminded me a little bit of Notorious at a couple different sections, especially with the whole idea of, like, you know, these neo-Nazis post-World War II trying to seize back power of things they had before and during World War II. That's a super fascinating plot thread that I see a lot of film noir and film around this time dealing with. It was very reminiscent of something like Notorious. So Munson, Gilda's husband, is visited by German mobsters. They had, like, funded a cartel together, and then they transferred ownership to him before World War II had started, so that they could hide any connection. And then once World War II is over, they try and take back ownership of it, and that's kind of the crux of the gangster issue. And that's really interesting to me too, because usually in film noir, like, the details matter in an interesting way, but they don't matter, like, in terms of this. Like, this feels like very interesting social commentary, in that it feels like it's indulging very strongly in that mythos of, well, what happened to all the Nazis who kind of disappeared? Or what are they doing now? Did they go back to society? Did they run off to blah, 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 blah? And especially the film being set in Argentina, because there's the whole idea and the whole, you know, theory that a bunch of Nazis fled and just kind of went to South America. And so the film going into that is super interesting, because it plays off of the gangster element of the film noir genre for sure, but it also takes a really interesting approach at tying in World War II to it. And because, you know, it's 1946, there's no way in a big movie you're not going to necessarily deal with World War II in some way or another, especially in Hollywood studio systems. So that's a really, really interesting part of the film as well. And then the end of the film is also intriguing to me, because the idea that Johnny and Gilda both, I guess, for lack of a better term, get over themselves, I guess, and they apologize for the emotional wounds and X, Y, and Z, and then they come together at the end. It feels genuine in a way that I don't think it usually would in films of this era, especially when you look at the, you know, circumstances of the abuse. I think the way that Charles Vidor, I think the way he goes into the fine details between the abuse that they're both exerting towards each other makes it so that the ending is a little bit more satisfying, and not like, oh god, she's going to an abusive dude, wow, how terrible is that. It feels very, like, even keel in that kind of sense, and so the end of the film doesn't necessarily feel like a problematic ending, at least for me, for sure. So anyway, that is it for Gilda. Thank you guys so much for watching. It is Noir November. Our last episode of Noir November is coming up tomorrow. Like I said, we're covering Lady from Shanghai, Mildred Pierce, and Sunset Boulevard. 3 excellent movies. And then we will be doing the horror show and the Saturday show. And then we'll be moving into December for 007 December. So excited. But thank you all so much. I will see you later today with the Nightmare on Elm Street episodes. And then I will see you tomorrow with the Saturday show and the final episode of Noir November. Bye.